In the coming years, many will attempt to describe the governor's impact on the Commonwealth of Virginia. And regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, we can all agree it has been landscape changing, bold, transformational. And while there are many accomplishments one could point to in support of those characterizations, none of those are perhaps as history-defining as the one for which we have gathered here today to bear witness. The arc of the moral universe is long, but today, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, it bends sharply towards justice. It is my greatest honor to introduce one of the strongest proponents of that pivotal change. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome His Excellency, the 73rd Governor of Virginia, Ralph S. Northam.
Please be seated. Please. Thank you so much, and good afternoon, and just all of you. Thanks for joining us today for this truly historic moment in Virginia's history. There's so many people to thank, and I just want to acknowledge some, but first of all, starting with our legislators who have done so much great work, especially during my term and as governor, but over the years. Senator Scott Surovell, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for your leadership. Delegate Mike Mullen. Mike, thank you so much. Delegate Ken Plum, thanks for joining us today. Senator Mamie Locke. Mamie, thank you. Senator Louise Lucas, thank you so much. Delegate Jay Jones, welcome Jay. And Delegate Charnel Herring, thank you so much for all that you've done. I want to also thank the folks here at Greensville Correctional Center, our director, Harold Scott. Harold, where are you? Thank you so much for your leadership. We are truly blessed in the Commonwealth of Virginia to have you, and so please pass on to your staff how proud we are of all the great work that you do for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Again, to be here at Greensville Correctional Center today, since this has been here since 1991, and this prison, as we all know and have been reminded, has housed Virginia's death chamber. I have just finished a tour, including the execution chamber. I don't know how else to describe it, but other than say that it is a powerful thing to stand in the room where people have been put to death. I know that experience will stay with me for the rest of my life. And it reinforced me that signing this new law is the right thing to do. It is the moral thing to do to end the death penalty in the Commonwealth of Virginia. This is a major change because our Commonwealth has a long history with capital punishment. Over our 400-year history, Virginia has executed more than 1,300 people, more than any other state. For 200 years, those executions happened in downtown Richmond at the old Virginia State Penitentiary on Spring Street. Virginia's history, we have much to be proud of, but not the history of capital punishment. Like many people, when I was young, I believed in an eye for an eye. But as I matured, my mind changed, And when I ran for office, I committed to work on ending the death penalty in Virginia. And as I have learned more about how the death penalty is applied in this country, I can say that the death penalty is fundamentally flawed. Most importantly, we know that the system doesn't always get it right. Let's take the case of Earl Washington, Jr. In 1984, Mr. Washington was wrongly convicted of a crime that he didn't commit. His conviction came following a coerced confession and led the jury to sentence him to death. Just a year later, Mr. Washington sat on Virginia's death row with an execution date set. The issues with his case finally got in front of the right people. Just 9 days before his execution would have been carried out. This system was 9 days from executing an innocent man. The lesson here is not that the system worked. The lesson here is that the system did not work. The system allowed an innocent man to be convicted of murder. And while Mr. Washington is the only person we know of rescued from Virginia's death row, can we really, truly be sure that there aren't others? In fact, around the country, more than 170 people have been released from death row since 1973 due to evidence of their innocence. That is simply wrong. We can't give out the ultimate punishment without being 100% sure that we're right. And we can't sentence people to that ultimate punishment knowing that the system doesn't work the same for everyone. Ending the death penalty comes down to one fundamental question, one question. Is it fair? For the state to apply this ultimate final punishment, the answer needs to be yes. Fair means that it is applied equally to anyone, no matter who they are. And fair means that we get it right, that the person punished for the crime did the crime. But we all know that the death penalty cannot meet those criteria. So it is not fair. It is applied differently based on who you are, and the system has gotten it wrong. We know that this Commonwealth's use of capital punishment has been inequitable. In the 20th century, 296 of the 377 defendants that Virginia executed for murder were black. I'm going to repeat that. 296 of the 377 defendants that Virginia executed for murder were black. Of the 113 individuals who have been executed in Virginia since 1976, 52 were black. And studies have shown that a defendant is 3 times more likely to be sentenced to death if the victim of a crime is white than if the victim is black. And that is simply wrong. And that is why it is time in this Commonwealth of Virginia to end the death penalty. Virginia has a long and complicated history, like other southern states. The racism and discrimination of our past still echoes in our systems today. And as we continue to step beyond the burden of that past, it is vital that we also change the systems in which inequality continue to fester. We've started by reforming other criminal sentencing laws and other work to pry unjust policies out of the fabric of our criminal justice system. Ending the death penalty is the next vital step in that process. There is no place today for the death penalty in this Commonwealth, in the South, or in this nation. The road to this day has been a long one, but one which has been championed by so many who fought tirelessly to do what's right. In a moment, we will hear from Senator Scott Surovell and Delegate Mike Mullen, and I sincerely thank them for championing this reform. But first, I want to take a moment to recognize every person and organization that committed themselves to this cause. From the faith leaders to the community leaders to the legal advocates, on behalf of the Commonwealth of Virginia, I want to say thank you. Virginia's criminal justice reform has occurred because of your hard work and that of so many who came before me and who came before us. Today, Virginia becomes the first southern state to end this practice. We join 22 other states in saying the government will not take a life, the government will no longer execute people. Now, make no mistake, if you commit the most serious of crimes, you will be punished. But Virginia can do that without continuing a system that gets it wrong even once, and a system that doesn't work the same for everyone who encounters it. Justice and punishment are not always the same thing. That is too clearly evident in 400 years of the death penalty in Virginia. So today, Virginia takes an important step forward. And again, I thank everyone who has worked so hard to change this law. So thank you to all of you. And now I'd like to ask Senator Scott Surovell to say a few words. Scott, welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to start, likewise, before I forget, just to thank a lot of the people who've been with us in this fight, the 12 years I've been fighting it as a state legislator. VADP, Virginians for the Alternatives for the Death Penalty, Michael Stone, their executive director, Virginia Podboy, their new executive director. They've been out there on the front lines of this from day one. The ACLU, Virginia ACLU has been out there helping us beat the drum. The Virginia Catholic Conference has been a very potent force from the moral side. They've also had some of their priests make some phone calls to some members that needed some reassurance. And can't tell you how much that has helped. The Virginia Capitol Defender Service, I know one of my JMU classmates, Doug Ramsura, is here, who worked there for 17 years. Do not underestimate how important the absence of people on death row made in terms of making people feel like it's time that we need to do this. We finally provided people with the defense that they deserved, and you can see in terms of the outcomes how much of a difference that's made in terms of how justice is meted out in Virginia. And lastly, I just want to say Governor Northam, who without his endorsement, public endorsement, before this session, I think that was pretty important for several members, especially 2 members of my caucus, which I think made a big difference in terms of the vote. But I just want to say, to start off, I went through those doors in July of 1993 when I was a governor's fellow under Governor Wilder. I'd just gotten out of college, and I became a governor's fellow as like an intern that you do with a cabinet level person, but they would take us on these field trips, and one of the places they took us to was here. And I don't think they just brought us here because it was a prison. They wanted us to see a prison. They wanted us to see the death chamber. And back then, we didn't have lethal injection. All we had was the electric chair. And they walked us through. They took us to a geriatric ward. Eventually they took us into the death chamber. And I'm pretty sure the tour was given by Jerry Givens. And the chair was sitting right there in the middle of the room. And I can't tell you the impact it has on you to be in that room, to see that device, to have to think about how many people sat in it, not only in that room, but also in the Richmond Penitentiary. And, I looked at that time, and all I could think of was sort of disgust, revulsion, eventually, reflecting on it, really sort of dismay and embarrassment about how I felt like my state was operating. And I never thought I'd be back here today doing this, I can tell you that. It definitely motivated me in terms of my personal views. It gave me something to think about and to motivate me as a legislator. But I never dreamed that Virginia would change as fast as it did. When I was first elected in 2009, I was elected about 6 months after Delegate Herring. That first session we served in the 2010 General Assembly, one of the hardest votes we had to take that session was to expand the death penalty. One delegate was carrying the trigger man rule. And I think myself and I think Delegate Herring and about maybe 20 other members voted against that. But about half our caucus voted to expand the death penalty that year. And that's sort of where public opinion was. It's where the parties were at that time. Being against capital punishment was not a popular position in 2010. I remember going into one of my first debates as a candidate that year, being afraid that I was going to get asked that question and worrying about how voters might react if they heard that I was against capital punishment. But I never got the question the entire campaign cycle. But we were in a very different place, even in 2010. And 2014, I heard somebody else from the Capitol Defender Service give a speech about the history of the electric chair, and so I put in a bill to make the electric chair to try and prohibit that in Virginia. And I'm not even going to get into the history of that, but it's a truly sordid one. And of course, that bill didn't go anywhere, but it sent the message, and it got the Virginians for Alternatives, the VADP, more motivated that we could actually maybe start to do something. 2015, we had the lethal injection secrecy rules that we beat back that session. 2016, they ended up passing, so we could continue to use lethal injection, but we fought it. And then this last session, I thought we might have a chance to actually pass this. And I remember Senator Locke, our caucus chairman, called our meeting in when we were in Harrisonburg trying to figure out some of the things we were going to take on as a caucus. And I said, what about capital punishment? There was about, I'd say, between 5 and 7 members that didn't feel comfortable taking that on yet. And that was just 2 years ago. And I worked on them one at a time. And eventually, we were able to get the votes together to get it through. And I think if we had tried last session to get it on the floor, it wouldn't have passed. But this year, I think, was the year. I think Governor Northam's endorsement made a big difference for people, along with George Floyd and a few other things that have happened in this country over the last 12 months. But, I think what keeps people up at night about this largely is 2 things. One is the history of this in Virginia, and the other thing is the innocent. And I was reading, Virginia's history on the death penalty is really ugly. And it doesn't get written a lot. It needs to be written about more because people need to understand what the history is. And right before I came here, I was looking around. I read an article about the Martinsville 7. And in that article, it talked about how between 1908, when Virginia instituted the electric chair, and 1948, when the Martinsville 7 were convicted, Virginia had 808 white men who were convicted of rape. Not a single one of them got the death penalty. But 45 black men were executed for rape. Not a single white man who committed 808 rapes, not a single one. That says to you a lot about what death penalty was used for. In fact, Senator Locke talked on the floor about you saw a direct correlation between the rise in the death penalty in Virginia by the government and the end of lynching. And the connection is really undeniable. And that's the history. That's where this comes from. And some people argued on the floor that, well, we've got the Capitol Defender Service, we figured out how to do this. The problem is the innocent. And that is the one argument that nobody ever countered on the floor. We had this argument for 2 hours in the Senate. Not a single person could say, how do you justify killing one innocent person for every 9 guilty people that you execute? Nobody can justify that. And that's, I think, what has really caused a lot of folks to come around on this issue, the exoneration issue, because we realize we just can't get this right. So the reason it makes people uncomfortable is because of our values and our history. I started this morning at my home. On my way here, I stopped at Gunston Hall, which is the home of George Mason. George Mason he attended the Constitutional Convention, but he refused to sign the U.S. Constitution because it didn't contain a Bill of Rights. George Mason wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights in June of 1776, before we declared our independence. And in that declaration, we declared for the first time in the world that we as human beings have certain rights against our government. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, but we also have the right to trial by jury. We have the right to subpoena witnesses. We have the right to cross-examination. We have the right to not be compelled to have testimony. We have a right to a jury of our peers. We have a right to speedy trial. We have fundamental human rights, fundamental rights in our justice system. And I started there this morning because to pay homage to George Mason, to our Declaration of Rights that was eventually became our U.S. Bill of Rights in 1883. Because as somebody put to me the other day, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a federal prosecutor. He says what we finally figured out here is that we finally figured out that we can no longer, while some people may feel very angry when a murder is committed, when somebody may feel that morally there may be some reason, I don't feel that way, but some people feel there's morally a reason to use this kind of sanction, it is fundamentally impossible to utilize this type of sanction in a country like ours that values fundamental human rights the way we do. It is impossible to use this remedy. It doesn't work. It's impossible. It doesn't comport with our current values. And so from my point of view, with what Governor Northam is about to do in a few minutes, is he is going to restore Virginia to its position of leadership, not just in the country, but also in the world, as a society, as a government that values civil rights, that values your rights against the government, that values things like your rights to trial by jury, your right to confrontation, your right to be notified of what you're being charged with. This restores us to a place of prominence in the world, makes us a leader in justice, which is where our state originally was in 1776 when we came into our existence. And so that's why I'm so proud to be here with the governor, with my co-patron, Delegate Mullen, Delegate Plum, who put in the bill in 1980 to repeal capital punishment. Sure, he's finally here to see this done after 31 years. It's a very important day for human dignity, for fairness, for justice, and I'm proud to be part of it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Senator Surovell, for those wonderful words. I want to take a moment just to be able to thank everyone here who's spent so much of their time, their energy, and their experience. I want to, in particular, thank Senator Surovell. Governor, thank you for your leadership. This would not have happened without your guidance. Leader Herring, thank you for being here. Thank you for being such an amazing co-patron and for working on this since you first came to the General Assembly. Delegate Jones, thank you for your leadership and everything that you've done. Senator Lucas, it seems like you're everywhere across the Commonwealth at all times. God bless you. Thank you for everything that you do to be able to make our Commonwealth a better place. And then finally, number one, Delegate Plum, someone who put in this bill before I was born, and who's been fighting on this issue as a moral one for decades. So I guess I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to talk for a moment about the history of this moment. I am honored every day to represent Jamestown Island. And in 1608, Captain George Kendall was the first person executed in the English-speaking New World. And since then, Virginia executed almost 1,400 people. That is more than any other state in the Union. Goodness gracious, that's an ignoble list to be at the top of. And I say that because we've carried out the death penalty in an extraordinarily unfair fashion. We've executed almost 1,400 people, and yet the first time that an African American was the victim and the defendant was white was 1997. 1997. And only 4 times out of almost 1,400 was the defendant white and the victim black. And I say this on my way here today from Williamsburg. I stopped at Old Point Comfort, which many of you are familiar with. It's the space in Hampton where we had the entry of the first enslaved Africans here in the New World come to Virginia. And I was struck by something that Senator Lucas actually spoke about on the floor, about how the death penalty was intrinsically linked to the decline in lynching, and how that this is something that became an institutional action to be able to keep down communities of color. And I think that it's important to recognize that. And finally, I work as a criminal prosecutor. That's been my job the majority of my adult life. I've held hands with victims of murders. I did it this week. I did it last week. And I'll probably do it again next. And I can tell you this, it doesn't bring anybody back. It doesn't bring justice. And all the cries of vengeance that you hear are valid and emotional and painful, but they don't bring people back. That's not justice. And I will say this before I close. I've probably prosecuted, I don't know, 10,000 cases at this point. And every statistic that we've seen is that between 2 and 10% of all verdicts in the country are incorrect. And I've worked my rear end off the entirety of my adult career to make sure that that doesn't happen. But statistically, we have to acknowledge that. And as Senator Surovell said, that one question of what you do with the innocent person executed. I don't know what to say to the last person's family who was executed because we wanted vengeance in another case. I don't know how to speak to that. I genuinely think that we have the best criminal justice system in the country. And by that, I mean the best in the world. But it's still made up of people, human beings who sometimes make mistakes. And the death penalty forgoes our ability to change that. And so I am greatly honored to be with you all here today. Thank you all for your leadership. And in about an hour, the Commonwealth will be a better place. Thank you all. And with that, actually, oh, Jane, all right, from Williamsburg, Jane Barnard, who's a friend, a colleague, and an amazing person as well. So thank you very much for being here, Jane.
And a constituent.
And a constituent.
I'm here, even shorter than everybody else, to speak on behalf of Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And I'm proud to be able to do that as its board vice president. I'm sorry that our board president is not able to be here. She just had a baby. It was too far and too complicated. So I am honored to speak in her stead. 30 years ago, in 1991, the Virginia death chamber was moved to this site, as the governor mentioned, from Richmond. 101 people were put to death in this facility. 100 men and 1 woman. Later, the same year, 1991, the founders of what is now VADP took their first steps toward ending state-sponsored killing. The steps were slow, the steps were arduous, but our journey at VADP is now over, thanks to many, many people who have supported us in many, many ways over these 30 years. I want to begin by acknowledging the essential role of Marie Deans in founding Virginia's death penalty abolition movement. Her work as a volunteer on death row in the bad old days resulted in the exoneration of Earl Washington. Her work to get attorneys to represent the men on death row saved lives and helped to humanize a brutal, awful environment. She was also a key figure in the creation of this organization. Virginia's faith community was the backbone of the early abolition movement. Religious leaders like Bishop Walter F. Sullivan, Reverend Fletcher Lowe, and many others spoke out publicly in opposition to the death penalty and provided spiritual comfort to those on death row and their family members. Local religious leaders all over the Commonwealth led execution vigils in their communities, and their communities provided crucial funding in the early years of VADP. We had other and have other allies, and I'm glad to see that several of our strongest allies are here, and I want to highlight their presence again. The Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. There you go. The Virginia Catholic Conference. And the Virginia ACLU. Together, we were able to accomplish what none of us could have done alone. Now, it would be impossible to discuss even the possibility of death penalty abolition if it were not for the extraordinary work of the Capital Defense Attorneys. Before and after 2002, we know the General Assembly created the Capital Representational Centers in 2002, and since then, the work and the successes of the attorneys have been remarkable. Attorneys, mitigation specialists, investigators, all have worked together. People like David Bruck, Jerry Zirkin, Rob Lee, and many, many others have represented indigent defendants accused of capital crimes for almost 20 years, and that work has come or will come to an end. But before we leave those professionals, we should note that they were responsible for a 90% decrease in death sentences during the 20 years they did their work. And no one in Virginia has been sentenced to death in the past 10 years. Another key group of advocates for death penalty abolition has been murder victim family members. People like Rachel Sutphin and Linnell Patterson and others. These courageous women and men have shared their intensely personal stories of loved ones lost and gone in order to educate the public, in order to educate members of the General Assembly, in order to let people know that the death penalty often fails victims and their families. Many of these victim advocates became opponents of the death penalty because of their own negative and sometimes traumatic experiences with the criminal justice system that they felt was more interested in retribution than in meeting their personal needs. And the abolition of the death penalty will make it possible to serve more effectively the needs of victims with resources that heretofore have been allocated to expensive trials, expensive appeals. That will now be able to be redirected. And another group that has helped us get where we are at this moment. Powerful floor testimony by legislators themselves who had lost loved ones to homicide helped secure the final votes. All 7 of the murder victim family members who serve in the General Assembly, 7, all 7 of them voted to end capital punishment. And finally, of course, we've heard the story, we know the story. What got us to the finish line were the people who had the votes and the governor who led them. We are very grateful to Senator Surovell, to Delegate Mullen. They worked long and hard publicly and privately to move this issue forward, and we are most immensely grateful to Governor Northam, who himself, publicly and behind the scenes, made this outcome possible. This is, as we know, a historic day for Virginia. We are the first Southern state to abolish capital punishment, but we will not be the last. And I am now very happy to introduce one of our strongest allies in the past year, Reverend Lakeisha Cook.
Good afternoon. So Governor Northam, thank you so much for this opportunity to share on this historic afternoon. To Senator Surovell, Delegate Mullen, thank you so much for your courageous leadership as you stood on the floor of the House and in the committee meetings and spoke truth to justice. Thank you, Leader Herring. Thank you to all of our legislators, because there is no way we could be here in this moment if it were not for your courage. Today, I stand here representing many people of faith all throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. Virginia Interfaith was very, very happy to be able to join in officially in this fight for abolition. Today, we turn the page in the history books of this great Commonwealth as we celebrate the end of the death penalty. A decade ago, this pursuit would have seemed impossible, given Virginia's status as a state with the second highest number of modern-day executions in the country. But today, as a result of the leadership of Governor Northam, the courage and hard work of Senator Surovell and Delegate Mullen and our legislators, the years of groundwork laid by relentless advocacy groups like VADP, ACLU Virginia, the Virginia Catholic Conference, because of the courage of the victim family members who spoke out in support of abolition of the death penalty. As a result of the amazing faith community who united their voices together, holding lynching site prayer vigils, faith leaders, over 430, who signed a letter of support in favor of abolition, because of the many emails and phone calls that were made to our legislators. All of this work has come together and helped bring us to this historical moment. Early death penalty statutes in the Commonwealth reserved the death penalty almost exclusively for Black people. In 1848, a person, whether they were free or enslaved, a Black person, could receive the death penalty for a crime that a white person would only receive 3 or more years in prison for, including murder, arson, treason, assault, and robbery. Executions were later used to punish white people, but for only the crime of murder, while Black people were routinely executed for a wide variety of offenses. As extrajudicial lynchings became commonplace in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the state responded by carrying out more state-sanctioned executions in order to placate and deter white mobs who threatened to take justice into their own hands for Black people accused of crimes. Between 1901 and 1981, nearly 6 times more Black people were executed in Virginia than white people. But today, we turn the page. Today, we begin a new chapter in the Commonwealth. We have reached the end of Virginia's legacy of the death penalty, which is deeply flawed and ineffective. And today, we start a new chapter, embracing the possibility of a new evidence-based approach to public safety, one that values the dignity of all human beings and is focused on transforming the justice system into one that is rooted in fairness, accountability, and redemption. We are so grateful for this day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate you. You did this for years.
You guys got
to get in the front.
Okay, I'll stand right here with her.
The Chief Patron, Delegate Mike Mullen. Thank you all so much. Senate Bill 1165, the Chief Patron, Senator Scott Surovell. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much. That concludes our program, and thank you for being with us.